And I also want to extend a thank you to N.A.P.S for extending the invitation for me to be here today. I too am a peer specialist. I'm not actively in that role in a paid position currently, just due to personal family circumstances. But what's really interesting and I'm willing to share with you is in the last several days, I've had folks reach out to me whom I've worked with before who have been in some tight spots and just needed the conversation and someone alongside them. And for one of the first times in a long time, it really felt like peer support in its genuine, truest sense for me and how I define that. And as we talk today about empowerment, specifically parent empowerment, you might get a sense as to why I felt that way today. So again, thank you all for being here. And our next slide, we'll go over a little bit of the agenda that we have so you know what how we're going to break things down, is we are going to talk about specifically parent empowerment. And before I get totally to that part of the conversation, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about empowerment and what that means, because it is a really big concept, if you will, and used in a lot of different ways. We're going to talk about why it's important, why parent empowerment specifically is important. And then what are the things that get in the way? What are the stumbling blocks or the barriers to achieving that, especially for parents? And then what can we do about that, the steps toward it? I'm one of those folks, I like to say, I don't like to complain about things unless I have a possible solution or I'm willing to engage in the discussion. And at the end of our time together today, I'll leave room for question and answers, but again, because we are a rather small group today, if questions come up along the way, if you want to put those in the chat, and Casey, if you can help me monitor that a little bit, if they come up, or just turn off or open up your mic and shout it out, I'm good with that as well. So on to our next slide, and that little bit of a conversation about empowerment and what that means. Again, it's a very big concept, and to be honest, there's no one clear, concrete definition that'll fit all the different disciplines and organizations or groups that use the term empowerment. One thing that we do know that people do believe in, some of the commonalities, is that it's defined as a process which enables people to commonly defined as a process that gives them the ability to make decisions that shape their lives. It gives them a little bit of control, if you will. So greater control and the ability to make decisions that impact the individual's life. And at its core, it's a construct that links the individual strengths that a person brings to the table or to the situation, and links it to community and society at large. And leads to hopefully proactive behaviors that can lend itself to change that's desired by the individual. Believe it or not, it's been around for a long time. There's research going back to the 50s and even before that. In my world, and perhaps in yours, it wasn't until the 80s where it started to be used or discussed a little bit more in the world of those affected by mental health. And it was a way for the medical system to move away from that model of problems and looking more at a strength base rather than a deficit approach to individuals. And while the theory of empowerment has roots with marginalized communities throughout the world, it does cross countless sectors and disciplines in our society. So this word empowerment, we'll hear about it in place in the political realm, as I mentioned, in the medical, educational realm. It's been a lot of chatter around there, especially in the last decade or so. Businesses, organizations, judicial process, youth justice, people involved with children and family services. Again, that word empowerment, it buzzes through all of those, which means there isn't one clear, concrete definition for that concept that can apply to all of those different entities where we might find empowerment. I want to mention that it's also really important for the youth that we serve, youth who are impacted by mental health, and it's really important. It's essential for them. For us today, though, we're going to narrow in on a very specific group of folks, that's parents, and not just any parent, but those who are parents or caregivers to those living with mental health challenges or emotional behavioral disabilities. Today, I will likely interchange those words, parent and caregiver. I recognize that everyone caring for youth and children with mental health or behavioral challenges aren't necessarily always the parent, quote unquote. So just that heads up in it. So if I were to summarize that whole notion of empowerment, it's a social process that helps people gain control over their own lives. It's a process that fosters power in people for use in their own lives, their communities, and in their society by acting on issues they define as important. In our next slide, we're going to take a little bit closer look at the concepts of empowerment. So in this situation, the concepts of the main parts of this word empowerment and what this process means is recognizing one's own needs and what's important to me. And how do I get to my full potential to have those needs met? By recognizing the skills and strengths that I have is a big part of it. So I have some control over my own life, control around my surroundings, being able to stand up for myself. How do I access the resources I might need to get there? And how do I make decisions? And I think these concepts could really apply to anyone if you think about it. And they're not a bad idea. They're actually, I think, very good in many, many ways. However, when we're talking about parent empowerment, there's an adjustment we have to make. Because when you're a parent, parenting children with mental health challenges, it becomes about our child and our family. And sometimes those I statements or my statements come down at a different level. And we could have a whole conversation on meeting the individual's needs first so that they can meet the needs of their child and their family. I'll leave that up to you. And if time allows at the end, we can dive a little bit deeper into that. So I'm going to take a next step and look at this process of parent empowerment and what does this process look like. And if you look at the slide, it speaks to us about the situation, right? The strengths, the situation that's lending itself. Excuse me. And in our discussion today, it's a situation with a child or there's some type of unmet need. In order to meet that need, I have to first identify what are the strengths that I have? What can I bring to the table? What can I build on? And by doing that, build on that. So empowerment, it's a multidimensional social process, is what we like to say, to help us gain that control over our own lives, a process that fosters power in people for use in their own lives, their communities, and society by acting on issues they define as important. And that's a key element. It's the parent defining what's important to their child and their family. I'm going to jump to the next slide and give you a more concrete definition, and then I'm going to come back and give you some examples of this. So it's pretty simple, right? Our working definition for today is confidence and skills that they need to care for their children and feeling in control is how we're defining parent empowerment today. It's I as the parent have some skills that I'm working with. I'm confident in using them, and it gives me control over the situations. So if we go back and look at the previous slide, it's sometimes easier to understand this one to go through an example. So in this particular one, I'm going to use a group of parents, actually folks I became very familiar with over the past several years, who the concern was or the challenge was their children were not learning to read. And so you could take any one of those single parents and say that they looked at the situation, and I'm going to disclose that they were also privileged in many ways. They were families who had resources and had some knowledge about what their kids needed. And so they pursued those endeavors. They looked into themselves, they reached out within their communities and were able to find tutors or other instructional supports after school hours or clubs or organizations that could help teach their child to read. So if we look at this process, the parent this was the situation, they looked at what skills they needed to further develop. So that was reaching out to formal instructors or again, tutors, et cetera, finding that so that the child's needs could be met. And that gives that greater sense of control. The piece that I left out of there that's important to understand, and maybe some of you have experience with this, is we know that when children have unmet needs, it often shows up in behaviors. And so if you have a kiddo who, for the sake of conversation, is in third, fourth, fifth grade, and they're not able to read at that level, and they're going to school each day, it's not uncommon to have all kinds of behaviors at school, and then the parent starts getting the phone calls, or you have the behaviors at home because the child can't meet those needs. But by this parent taking initiative and being able to reach out, get the support their child needs. Again, there's that control of the family environment and also having the need met. On a bigger level. So talking about that community and those societal pieces, the same group of parents, so each of them were dealing individually with their child who wasn't able to read, but those parents came together and they're like, it's not just our kids. They started looking at the state's tests and reading and learned that less than 40% of the children in our state were not reading at grade level by, and I apologize, I don't recall if it was third or fourth grade. And they armed together. They looked at their strengths, their individual strengths. There were parents who were really great at networking. There were great people able to do research, people who understood the legislative process, people who were great with numbers and data analysis, people who had time and creativity amongst them. And those people came together. And to make a long story short, they were able to tap into their community resources within themselves, build on those things, and actually got legislation pushed through in our state that was enacted this past year, at the start of this year, to change the way reading instruction is delivered to students. To me, that's just a really incredible example of parent empowerment in action, if you will, making a difference, not only for themselves, but for the people around them. I'm going to just take a brief pause and see if there are any questions or comments, or maybe someone else has an example that fits to this particular process. No? Then we will just keep on moving. So on our next slide, we have, and we'll go one more. We're going to talk about the family empowerment scale. And so, although this is a process, there's ways that researchers and now different organizations, I think this is a tool that even peer specialists, when working with families, could potentially use. There are agencies working with children and families that use it, called the Family Empowerment Scale. And it's a scale that's been around for over 3 decades, or I believe it was in the early 90s that it was developed. Perhaps some of you are even familiar with it. It was designed for those parenting children with a mental health diagnosis or emotional disability. There's a similar scale called the PEAM, which is the Parent Empowerment and Efficacy Measure, which was developed in about 2014, 2015, which is used with any family or can be used with any family. They have a better understanding of the parent's perception of their level of empowerment, and it captures the strengths and the needs, but it's only relevant to empowerment, unlike some of the scales you might be familiar with, such as the CANs or the FANs, which measure all kinds of strengths and abilities across various disciplines within a family. This instrument, the Family Empowerment Scale, looks solely at that notion of empowerment for families. And it focuses on the caregiver's sense of control or their capacity to engage confidently with the challenges of being a parent of a child with mental health or emotional challenges. And it can be a really useful tool and can be used to acknowledge that parenting today isn't easy, especially when you're struggling with kiddos who may have mental health challenges. I want to give you some examples of this. So this particular instrument has 34 different questions on it, and they break it into the categories of family, services, and community. And the specific questions ask the parent then to rate how they feel about that particular level of empowerment in that domain. So as I'm reading a couple of these, I want you to think to yourself how you might answer it. When problems arise with my child, I handle them pretty well. Think to yourself, where might you answer this on this scale? As a parent, this may have a lot of variables, at least in my mind. It's the problem getting another call from school because my child kicked the teacher again? Or is the problem walking in on my child self-harming worse? Or is the problem my child not being able to get out of the car for an appointment? And I often say, exactly what does pretty well mean? For me, I think each parent needs to define this for themselves. In my world, if everyone is safe, including myself, and I don't feel miserable, then I think I handled it pretty well. And I share that the input or the examples on that because whenever we're talking about things such as rating scales, and I'm sure most of you realize this too, is we always have to hone in on what it means to that particular family. And for example, the term pretty well, may mean different things to different people. Another sample question is, when I need help with problems in my family, I am able to ask for help from others. Again, how one defines problem may make a difference in being able to ask for help. It could be as simple as a scheduling conflict and I need someone to look after my child who has the mental health challenges. Or is it coming up short on this month's rent? Is it the conflict that my partner and I are having because we don't agree on how to parent our child? Um, Another factor could be where the family is at in their journey. Something to bear in mind is that for those parenting kids with mental health challenges or diagnoses, there's often this feeling of living in a parallel universe, if you will, that nobody else can really quite get it unless they're living something similar. Many families experience those feelings of blame, shame, fear, confusion, isolation, loss of employment, financial hardship, marital difficulties, loss of dreams and hopes. And I think that's for a lot of families, it oftentimes is unspoken, but when you have a child and you have these additional challenges, there's a grief and loss process that a lot of parents go through, and we need to be respectful of that because those emotions can be pretty powerful and it's easy for families to get stuck in them. But again, these are variables that might affect a person's response or ability or how they answer on this particular scale. Um, I think this particular question, there's also an assumption within the question that there's someone for the family to ask for help from. Um, but not every family is connected to other family members, or maybe they're new in their community. They don't necessarily have friends or neighbors, or maybe bridges have been burned already, or just their isolation has kept it from that. Another question that's asked in this particular scale that lends itself to this notion of empowerment is, I have a good understanding of my child's disorder. I'm a firm believer that parents know their children best. We may not have the medical or the educational jargon that goes along with a diagnosis or the situation, but they do know their kids best. The challenge with understanding a disorder is that oftentimes our kids have multiple labels from multiple providers, and it's not uncommon for it to change over time. A recent example comes to mind for me was a young man. He's a young man now, but he was originally diagnosed or labeled, if you will, when he was about 3 years old. It was recognized that he had significant early developmental trauma in his life, not only in utero, but endured some pretty extreme circumstances in the first few years of his life. And that is not a quote diagnosis that's listed or a qualifier on for special education, for example, in the schools. So he was also labeled as having ADHD and anxiety and some depression. And his parents came to parent him in all his quirks and idiosyncrasies and his strong emotions and his inability to regulate those emotions oftentimes and his getting stuck, and also recognized a lot of the developmental delays he had from talking and walking, etc. As he got older, those parents came to know him really, really well. And as he was preparing to enter the adult world and the adult world of services, it required another look or more intensive evaluation, neurological and psychological evaluations. And when he walked out of that testing scenario, he had a new label on him. He was identified as being on the autism spectrum, if you will. Now, he didn't change. Nothing changed in him over the years. It's just this label changed. And while the parents may not have known everything about autism or autism spectrum disorder, they knew their son. And so again, when questions such as this is that I have a good understanding of my child's disorder, I'm a little biased. I wish they'd say I have a good understanding of my child and their needs, because I don't like the word disorder to begin with, full disclosure, but also labels only tell a part of the story. And I do want to acknowledge that oftentimes those labels can be helpful to us in better understanding things and in communicating. And as we'll see, that ability to engage or enhance our communication skills are important when we're talking about empowerment. And so I think it's a fair question. It's just the way it's worded, and wanted to give an example of what that might look like. The next area is services on this particular instrument. When we talk about services, one of the questions that's asked on here is, I feel that I have a right to approve all services my child receives. And then the parent would rate that. Another one is, I know the steps to take when I'm concerned my child is receiving poor services. And I find this to be a really interesting question on this particular instrument. Um, because the parent's response, I believe, would may be tied to the impact and the relevance of the services are having on their child and the parent's willingness and capacity to take action on that. The example that comes to mind, excuse me, was a child who was receiving services. The parent didn't really understand the connection or like, what's the benefit of this, or wasn't seeing a whole lot of changes in her child. Just make sure she got him to his appointment each week for his 2-hour session and pick him up afterward. This gave that parent 2 hours of respite, if you will, respite being something really hard to come by sometimes. And so the question again, I know the steps to take when I'm concerned my child is receiving poor services. Um, I would beg to say that a parent may or may not take action on that if they don't think the services are efficient because it may be meeting another need. And as I mentioned earlier on, when we spoke about how empowerment is usually about that I and what's important to me, I think this is one of those little caveats where that parent is maybe looking out for themselves at that moment in time. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying it happens and to be aware of it as to how one might respond to an instrument such as the family empowerment skill. Um, Another one is I tell professionals what I think about services being provided to my children. And how does a parent do this? How they do it may make a difference, whether that conversation is congenial or blaming or shaming, etc. Other questions or examples are I'm able to make good decisions about what services my child needs. And I think this one can be difficult because it depends on whether or not I know what the possibilities are. I recall working real directly with service teams for children, and somebody at the table held the whole list of different possibilities for children. That parent, unless they had that same information, how could they make those informed choices? The information be brought forth and the parent provide input, but they weren't necessarily the ones in possession or having the knowledge of what the possibilities might be. Um, Community is the next area that's looked at. A couple examples are I feel I can have a part in improving services for children in my community. That gave that example earlier of the parents whose children had reading challenges. Another question that's asked is I help other families get the services they need. And I would argue that families have always intuitively known that sharing information, support, and advocacy with one another is a key component to overcoming the challenges of and raising and supporting our kids with behavioral health care needs. Um, I think that their behavioral health success depends on families who are well supported and knowledgeable about the systems they utilize, and families informally have a way of connecting and making that happen. Again, I think it depends on the individual circumstances as to whether or not a parent is able to do so on any level, whether it's phoning a friend or sometimes when you may never have even met in person. There's a lot of through social media and online opportunities now where families are connecting, but I think that happens in a real informal way often it can make a difference. And I think this is can be a very helpful tool for families, and especially when we're trying to figure out where they're at with empowerment. It's a free and easy tool to use. Some of the cautions I do have with it, though, is even though it's been used worldwide and used in all kinds of research, it has been used primarily, or some of the testing data on it is with white non-Hispanic families. So I would say take that into consideration. Any comments or questions about this particular tool or perhaps something that someone else has used from anyone? Okay, seeing none, then we're going to pop to our next slide that talks about why this is important. Why is parent empowerment important? Um, Scholars would say that empowerment is an important vehicle for helping parents find their voice, gain control over their lives, and advocate for their children. In short, it enhances a caregiver's ability to meet the challenges of raising a child with social, emotional, and/or behavioral needs, resulting in better outcomes. And if we look at these categories on our next slide, we can talk about them a little bit more. It's why it matters. So that increased engagement, for example, in the educational world, if we have increased engagement, we have better outcomes. At the educational level, we know this to be true regardless of whether a child has um, mental health or behavioral challenges within the school setting. But for any child, when parents are engaged with the school and with their child's learning, there's discussions, give and take. Test scores go up if you're a person who thinks test scores are important. Graduation rates go up, attendance rates go up, good things happen. When we talk about the medical or the medical realm, when we have parents who are empowered, the results are more positive treatment outcomes. Again, there's more follow through from the individuals with whatever the treatment plan may or may not be, looking to alternatives, supporting those decisions and the input. And at a social level, again, when we have that increased engagement and we feel empowered, there can be more networking and a family or individual can feel more supported in their situations. When we look at the advocacy level, there's the increased ability to advocate on behalf of the child and his or her needs and the needs of the family. And that, again, that area that's often overlooked is gaining the ability to advocate for oneself as the caregiver. And being able to say that, it's like, I need this in order to better meet my child's needs. Unfortunately, in this world of parent empowerment for our kids, we need to oftentimes, I can remember being coached myself, it always has to be based on the needs of my child. And sometimes that parent, that primary caregiver gets lost and their needs get lost in the process. But as a parent feels more empowered, we're able to put that out there more and help people better understand it. We also know through research that when parents are empowered, there's stress reduction within for the individual. So that is, in my mind, a form of that self-care, that looking at oneself, which is so important, and for the family as a whole. Although interestingly, the correlation between the stress reduction and empowerment, according to the research, happens more with younger children who are female than it does with older youth who are boys. I know originally when I first started learning or diving more into this, I had a thought that it would be more dependent upon the severity of the needs, but the research doesn't find that to be true. So I'm sure again there are a whole lot of reasons for that. But again, girls and female versus boys who are older. Some additional reasons are that it matters, as stated on our next slide, include enhanced communication. So when a parent develops or feels more empowered, the communication is improved typically, and there's more of it or it's enhanced and feeling more confident, whether that's in writing emails or making those phone calls, etc. Um, and the decision making and the interventions improve. So interventions being those service plans, whether it's what's happening in school settings or medical plans or even safety plans within home, those things often improve when the parent feels they have some control and voice in those situations. And one of the things that I think is one of the most profound reasons that we might do this is for the in a click of the button, Casey. I'll put it up on the screen. I think this is so important. It's reduce suicide risk factors for adolescents. So while stress goes down for younger children, what we do know is that when parents are empowered and have that voice, the risk factors for our kids who struggle the most are decreased. It doesn't get rid of it. It's not a panacea, but to me that offers just great encouragement that if I can find my voice as a parent so that I can increase my engagement and increase my advocacy for my child, I'm helping him or her to reduce the risk factors for suicide, which happens all too often in some of our worlds. And just pause again. Are there any questions or comments to this point? All right, I am going to put you to work on this next one though. So on our next slide, we're going to start to talk about the barriers. What are the barriers to a parent being empowered? And if you'd be so kind, either we can have the discussion, or if you're more comfortable placing it in the chat, if we just could get a few ideas or comments about what do you think, what are the things that are keeping us from keeping a parent from being empowered?
Stress.
Oh, stress, absolutely. Poverty, that's another good one. Yeah, our social economic status can make a difference, right? No support. Yeah. So stigma, big one. Absolutely. Yeah. Finances, that financial piece again. Absolutely. Great. These are really good responses. Um, yeah, and we're going to dive into those in a little bit. Having 3 jobs and not having enough few resources in the area. Wow, you guys are good. Absolutely. And we're going to, as I said, we're going to dive into those, and just to encapsulate a little bit more, is there are practices and behaviors, maybe even beliefs that are within each of us that can impede that empowerment. There are often things we can address as individuals within ourselves, and a lot of times we're aware of things in other people, but we can't change their behavior, but we might be able to influence it or impact it by our own actions or modeling, etc. So those interpersonal skills. And then, and this is the one that were most mentioned in the chat, are those external factors or those societal or community factors that happen. Those are those systems issues, if you will, and they are oftentimes more complex, but at least having an awareness of them can make a difference. And as we parents become empowered, we may grow in our capacity and desire to influence those systems so that we can have the changes that are desired. Our next slide breaks those barriers down into in a few areas. So some of them that were mentioned in the chat, for example, are that the stigma. It's like, just when you have a child with mental health challenges, or you yourself, or the behaviors that a child may have, the looks that you get, even just being in a store, for example, and your child's having, quote, an episode or a meltdown, or whatever the current language is of the day to describe what's happening. Really hard for a parent to reach out or to ask for help in those situations, because you can feel the eyes just piercing you, if you will. At least that's been my personal experience. Um, Lack of public understanding, communication breakdowns. We talked about the social economic status. Another one that's hard, somebody mentioned, working 3 jobs. It's also really hard when you're working with multiple systems. I mean, there are families who are involved maybe with, children in families, as well as juvenile courts, and the special education system. And each one of those systems seems to have their own rules and their own process for doing things, and trying to keep it all straight and know who to say what to. And by golly, if you have more than one child receiving services, to not get those things all mixed up sometimes can be really, really challenging. Um, Others, there's just lack of access to information can be a barrier for families. Um, Lack of public understanding, as mentioned. Communication breakdowns is another one, just not having the words, or sometimes it may even be a language barrier that can get in the way of it. Lack of trust. Consider the impact on the personal level, as well as how this can impact interpersonal skills, and recognizing it usually happens because of a negative lived experience, either interpersonally or within a system. And I'll use schools as an example. I mean, if a parent had challenging experiences within a school setting, it might be really hard for them to engage with a teacher, to step foot in that building and meet those individual needs of their child, or advocate on behalf of them, because they don't trust the system. Same thing could be said for medical, judicial, juvenile justice, any of it. Our lived experiences leave an imprint on us often. Within the systems, there's always the question of who gives power to whom and for what purpose. Simply to pacify, or are they truly trying to engage individuals to make a difference? I know myself, I've sat on various boards at the state level as well as the county level. And some of those seats were because it's in statute that there needs to be the voice of lived experience on it. And it's really interesting to me always how whether it feels like they're just checking a box, yep, that person's at the table, or if they really are trying to impact systems change and hear the voice. And it's not an easy process oftentimes because systems are so ingrained in the work that they do and the way things have always been, can be incredibly, incredibly challenging. And then there's this paradox, if you will, is that sometimes those within the systems who possess power trying to empower a parent. And the challenge is that maybe the parent's not ready for that. Think of those who have been fighting the battle, and I apologize for my language on that, but that's what it feels like for so many families, been doing that alone, not having those supports, having those other barriers that were mentioned in the chat. It's like, I don't want to do this myself right now. I need someone to help me and to walk it through with me or do it for me. And as we build those relationships, and maybe someone is having to do it for me, I can start to build the confidence and take the breath so that I can begin to develop those skills. Because remember, at the very top of this process, I spoke to finding what are our own strengths and how can we build on those skills and further develop those. And sometimes parents are just truly depleted, depending at where they're at on their journey or whatever's been going on up until that point, or maybe with even a certain realm of time. We have to hear what's important to that family at that point in time and take it from there. I want to share a story of a parent that helps to illustrate this. And as you're hearing it, I'm hoping that we can figure out like where some of those barriers were in this situation or what may have happened. This was a parent who knew her child was struggling in school, specifically in the area of reading. And don't get me wrong, this kiddo also had some behavioral stuff going on, mostly in the form of shutdown, but also developing some school resistance, not wanting to go to school, not wanting to get on the bus, those types of things. Once he got on the bus, didn't want to get off the bus. Um, it also happened that this particular parent knew a little bit about reading and reading instruction, having been a teacher herself. At parent-teacher conferences, she asked about her son's lack of progress and the approaches that were being taken. And the parent knew the questions to ask, and she knew the follow-up questions as well. Um, the parent knew that um, it was that she needed to tread gently because it was a new teacher. And she herself, the parent, had tears actually when she was talking about her son and those struggles that she was seeing and wanting to know, so what's happening at school? What does that look like? How are you doing this? What's happening? Um, because she also knew that the delay her son had was having an impact on him. She didn't identify it at the time as his mental health, he just all these behaviors, right? So those things I mentioned about, getting to school and the shutdowns, but at home it was more of explosive behavior and I hate school and papers being torn, etc. And this parent was pretty exacerbated at that time. So again, she had this conversation with the classroom teacher, and there was also a special education teacher with her in that particular parent-teacher conference. What happened was within 2 days, that parent received a registered letter from the school administrator instructing her that she was no longer allowed to meet with any teacher within, quote, his building, unless he was notified first and he could contact them and meet together. Um, the parent really struggled with this because she knew that she had aimed to focus on how to have her son's needs met, and she even reached out to that second teacher who was in the room who substantiated the parent perspective. Yeah, you were respectful, you weren't threatening, which was language that was used in the letter from the administrator. And while the full story of that parent continues yet today, I can tell you that she was able to reach out to an organization that provided parent peer support to her, and together they navigated the system to work toward the child's needs being met. And I share this to illustrate several points. One, that even when a parent feels confident, has the skills and the knowledge, it doesn't make things necessarily easier, sometimes even more difficult, as in this situation. And there are factors beyond one's control that come into play. Um, I'm curious if any of you, as you were listening to it, what you thought some of those factors might have been in the scenario that was just shared, or what some of the barriers may have been. Anyone care to voice anything or share in the chat? Well, if we were to categorize it, I would say that the teacher perception um, definitely played a role. Clearly, the teacher felt threatened by the words. Perhaps she didn't have as much knowledge as the parent did when it came to reading. And this whole process of parent empowerment and those processes we go through, it doesn't apply only to parents. I think, again, anyone, it may apply to anyone. And if that teacher wasn't feeling confident, that probably played a role into things. It could have also been the parent delivery, how that parent presented herself, the language she used, could have been a barrier to being heard and understood. And then there was also the administrative role, that person's perspective, even though they hadn't been in the situation directly, their need for power and control, which oftentimes can become a barrier to any given situation when one feels that level of power and to exert that without understanding the full steps of the situation. The parent, I know she felt distraught by the situation. She was angry, she was fearful, fearful that her child's needs would not be met, fearful of what people were saying about her, fearful that she couldn't keep going, knowing that unmet academic needs can greatly impact the mental health of a child. And she saw this daily decline in her son. She was beginning to lose hope. The impact that others within systems have on a parent can either support or diminish their sense of empowerment. The parent could have abided by the threatening letter she received and solely empowered the school to meet her child's needs, but she didn't. She knew how to reach out to others to lend the support and guidance that she needed so she could make a difference for her son. So when we think back to that process at the beginning where I spoke to, identifying the need and the strengths, tapping in and building those skills and then resolving the situation and then having an impact on community and society, sometimes you have to circumvent and go down to community and reach out to the resources within that community to um, to make a difference and get the help and support that's needed. Because I know somebody popped in. Most important is the advocacy from the parent for the good of the child. Absolutely. Be respectful and courteous. Sometimes administrative staff and teachers are defensive no matter what. I appreciate that point because sometimes they are. And the shift in focus that I've made on that when it comes to um, those type administrators, for example, within schools, is that they're trying to protect their staff, and I'm really glad for that, but it's not necessarily the best practice. We need to have a voice coming together and being able to communicate. And sometimes, hopefully, that comes with time and with continued practice or opportunities, if you will. Any questions about the barriers? And we're going to pop to the next slide. So what do we do about it? How do we support this notion, this process of parent empowerment? And there are a number of things that we can do to support empowerment. And we're going to take a look at a few examples in a moment. But first, I'd like to share briefly about a law, the only one I know of that actually supports and requires parent empowerment. Anyone want to take a guess at what that is? What law requires parent empowerment? No takers? Casey, you want to click and we'll give it. What law supports parent empowerment is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, oftentimes just referred to as IDEA. It supports parental rights in education, and this law allows children with disabilities to receive, free and public education. And our next slide shows us how that parent empowerment comes into place here. It recognizes the importance of the parental participation, empowerment for school-age children with disabilities, and it requires schools to treat parents as equal partners who collaborate with staff to choose what services their children need. It provides for that with two mechanisms, the procedural safeguards that describe and protect the rights of parents and children, and secondly, parent training and information centers whose mandate is to assist parents to understand IDEA and become effective advocates for their children. While this may be what the law is, I've lived too long and have been a part of the process on both sides of the table as an educator, as a parent, as well as an advocate to know that just because the law says something, that doesn't mean it's necessarily happening. So there's still work to be done, if you will. On this particular slide, you'll see in the lower left corner is the parentcenterhub.org, and it can be a very resourceful website that does speak to IDEA and becoming well versed with it. I always oftentimes chuckle to myself when they speak about the procedural safeguards that describe and protect the rights. Um, it's at least the one that I've typically received in our district. The print was so small that it wasn't readable, at least not with, and that was even before I wore bifocals. So it just wasn't readable. And by having the ability to advocate though and speak up and to be able to share that, the district moved to a point where they send it electronically, and then clearly a person can just make the font larger, et cetera, so it becomes more accessible. But that is a tool that when people are more well versed with it, excuse me, can be very, very helpful to a parent finding their voice. The challenge comes sometimes when the parent knows more than the people at the table. And that's not a criticism of educators. I have utmost respect for them, but they can't possibly know everything. And when you're passionate about something, when it's affecting your own individual child, we tend to soak things in a little bit more. Our next slide shows us um, that the exact things that are potential barriers are the same things we need to consider if we want to support and encourage parent empowerment. And that's listed on our next slide, that those areas are the personal, interpersonal, and our system and the systems factors. All right, on our next slide, we'll talk about those three areas, those things that are barriers, and how do we help them, or how do we access or tap into them to help build the skills in those areas. We need to remember that to support parent empowerment, we need to know what this means for each family, and it might look different for each individual family. And again, that's where that tool, the family empowerment scale, can be helpful. Where are they at when it comes to empowerment? And we start to work from there. I think someone mentioned this earlier, is encouraging parents' views to be heard, engaging in dialogue when decisions are being made, and contributing to efforts to bolster the emotional and the social resources that families have at their disposal. I think we have a big group of folks here who have a lot of experience, I'm guessing, with supporting parents or maybe even others. What might some of these things sound like if you were trying to put them into practice? Like if you were trying to engage in the dialogue or encouraging a parent to engage in the dialogue where decisions are being made about their child, how do you help a parent get to that point? What are the things that you've done, or how do you prepare a parent for that? Anybody willing to share anything?
We have to this is Diana Mendez. I'm a parent peer advocate. And I believe it has to do with trust, but also reminding them that you have the same lived experience that they do, and that
Yeah,
you can walk that journey with them,
yeah,
and letting them know that you're gonna meet them where they're at, and with the right resources, they will get through it as you did.
absolutely. I really appreciate that, Diane. I think you're absolutely right. Building trust and building that relationship. And I think those are some of the initial key things. So when we talk about parent empowerment, and if I, as an individual, am going to be the one to help support that in a parent, those two things are going to be critical, right? And being, when we're comfortable and when it's appropriate to share that personal journey or parts of it, or, to give examples. I think examples are a great way of getting families or parents to be able to start to engage, and, to say, I can remember when I sat at the table and it felt like it was all, over my head. And helping them to understand that once they engage, that it can make a difference for them. And I think what your example to also speaks to that, bolstering that emotional support, just knowing that somebody else has been on a similar journey, not the same journey, but has faced similar systems and stigmas and all the things we talked about earlier, those barriers, it can make a big difference.
I recently had a case that was referred to me that when the first 5 minutes of going there, I said, no, I can't do it. I can't do this case. I called the supervisor. It's not gonna work. And the parent, she's a adopted parent, and she was under the impression when I came there, I was gonna take the child out for a couple of hours, come back. So I explained to her this is not respite. One of the services is CPST, some skill building, and also for her family care support. Because I was able to stand stern and said, this is not what I do, but what I can do for you, I'll reach out to the supervisor and I'll find out if there's a case that can take on the case. And also I want to review the treatment plan to see if that's what is done, because respite and this is two different entities. So after a while, when I was trying to get the case back, she started telling me all this stuff, what she was feeling and what she was going through, and I listened, and I validate the frustration. Then she was like, you know what, you can stay. I can work with you. Um, I want you to you was honest with me. You was not gonna take me to taking a kid out. You said no, I don't do that. I said I was stern and I said that's not what I do. And we had a good session. I was there for 4 hours.
Awesome. And I heard you say something that I think is also so essential is that validation. It's like you have every right to feel this way. And when we can validate parents and they feel heard, I think that's another critical step into empowering them and having the right voice be able to do that so they can speak out. Thank you for sharing with us. That means a lot. Any other examples or comments on those steps that we can take? I think, and again, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but it does start with building those relationships, creating that feeling of safety and trustworthiness, transparency. Who was it just said, I was honest. I told him that's not my role. This is what I do, but I can listen. That whole notion of true peer support, being able to collaborate and have mutual goals and mutual steps that can be taken together. It's also really important that we take our cultural, historical, and gender issues into consideration as we're building that. Again, each individual's personal story and where they're at. We need to listen to what parents say. We need to feel good. Um, Parents want to feel good about their lives, right? And their families, and we need to help build or support that sense of community. It's also true that empowerment theorists, they emphasize that empowerment practice must address the personal, interpersonal, and institutional or political dimensions. And what this means in simple terms is that we need to speak openly about power inequities, regardless of where they're from, whether it's race, role, gender, economic status, education, age, etc., is to be able to call it out. And if you recall, when I started this afternoon, I mentioned that I've had parents call, some folks I've worked with in the past, and I felt like I was in this true role of peer support. And that's because, and I don't know how this gets changed, but when I was in the role of peer support, it was a paid position. And I often felt that simply by me receiving a paycheck to be at the table with that parent, and the parent knew it, that there was this little bit of power that wasn't there. And I think as parent peer specialists, it requires us to work that much harder at equalizing that to let them know that, yeah, I maybe have some more knowledge or skills, but I am more than happy to share that with you and help you on that journey of also being empowered if that's your desire. Our closing slide and just a few closing remarks to help us again kind of pull it all together is that increased parental empowerment is as much derived from the parents' own efforts and resourcefulness as it is from the professionals' encouragement and willingness to develop it. So it's not a one-way street. We have to be able to work together. But just because a professional is saying, I'm going to empower you and you make these decisions, that may not be where a parent's at or what that parent wants at that moment in time. And at the same time, when those offers are extended, whether it's from the peer support or other professionals, the parent is going to have to take some kind of action, and that's more likely to happen when they feel supported in that process. Some might argue that empowerment has been widely used as a buzzword, especially in the delivery of services to families and kiddos with mental health needs. And then we have the culmination of tightened fiscal policies, increased participation by parents in the care of their kids, and at the same time that there's a decrease in the availability, the needs seem to have gone up, and that means more demands on parents, supporting parents in gathering the knowledge. And as somebody said in the chat, knowledge is everything. The skills and the confidence that are earmarks of parent empowerment, it's never been more important than it is today. while a lot of the research on empowerment has remained theoretical, there are some of us, I will say, that who strive to operationalize the concept and empower parents so they may have confidence in the skills they need to care for their children. For parents to gain or take control involves both having to articulate their demands and endure a degree of stress. It's not easy. Just because we're empowered doesn't mean that those stress factors come all the way down, a little bit, but not everything. Whereas some parents may perceive this responsibility as liberating, others may find it burdensome, reminding us of the uniqueness of each family's journey, where they're at, what's important to them, and what they want their strengths and what their needs are to be. And with that, I'd like to open it to questions that anybody might have or comments before we close up. We're coming up against the clock. Anyone? Questions, comments?
Oh, hi. I just wanted to say thank you for having this webinar and this workshop. And also that, I'm not a parent myself, but I do understand that, parents are, they have a lot to do with and juggle and multitask with. And, you know, uh, yeah, it takes a lot to do that. And, I very like my hand goes out to all the parents out there that's doing that, like my mom who's a parent and my dad who has kids of his own. And that, they really sacrifice a lot to take care of their kids and, be um caretakers and stuff like that. So, I definitely tip my hat off to all the parents doing
Thank you.
their thing, yeah, and really like showing out and
Yeah.
and even those who aren't biologically parents but who are caregivers too, because kids do need that affection and that care and stuff like that. So I definitely tip my hat off to all the parents out there and all the caregivers, all the grandparents, and
Well,
all the people
they,
that doing what they have to do, to take care of the kids and the young people.
yeah. Thank you, Nishiba. And it goes, I thank you for being here because I think the more that we all understand each other's roles, it makes a difference. Thank you. Diane, I think you had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say this was a great webinar, very informative, and I like
you.
the fact that you had information on the pros, why we need this, and I love anything that has to do. It wasn't data per se, but the reasons why we need to do what we need to do to help the families and help ourselves. I have a child or 28 on the spectrum, and that's going to be through the lifespan. And
Yeah.
things change, and
Doesn't go away.
navigating, yes,
I just,
navigating the systems are
yeah,
very hard.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's wonderful,
Thank you for that.
wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you. I'm
you.
humbled.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Diana, if this maybe isn't the most positive way to wrap things up, but I was a parent I mentioned had reached out earlier and I met with her and really, really struggling with the situation. And she said, it scares me that I'm even saying this, but she said, when their child is struck with a terminal illness and that child passes, there's like this end. But when you're parenting kids with mental health challenges or on the spectrum, etc., it's lifelong, as long as we're all breathing. And yeah, as you said, it changes it back and forth in
It's a
each
roller
stage of
coaster
life.
ride.
Amen.
Everything is fine, and all of a sudden
It's
something
not.
comes up. So that's where you have to enjoy and take care of yourself, self-care, fill your cup,
Absolutely.
because you don't know
Absolutely.
when those days are coming, and it doesn't matter how much you try to teach, the individuals. We're only human. Everyone
Yes.
processes things differently. So I really enjoyed
Absolutely.
this webinar. I
Thank
really
you.
did.
I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for your kind
Thank
words.
you. Thank
Anyone
you.
else, comments, questions, or anything else you'd like to share before we wrap it up? Right. Well, I just would like to thank you all for being here today, sharing your input, your comments, and for doing what you all do. The world needs more people like those gathered here today. So thank you and wishing you all the best. And